Hello and welcome to level7cloud.com, and today we'll be doing an introduction to Ansible. Ansible is a automation tool to allow you to quickly and easily manage and build your servers according to your specifications. And so we're going to be going through and demonstrating what are some of the basic components of Ansible and how they work, and getting it up and running with a very basic setup and configuration. Um, Ansible is by far much more powerful than what I'm going to be showing in the demonstration, but this will at least give you an initial idea of um, how it works and uh, get you started. First thing you're going to want to do is set up an Ansible server, and this is the server that is going to be the server that you're going to be running all of your Ansible commands from. And then think of this as the base server. And Ansible is a agentless application, so you only have to install uh, Ansible on this one server. The rest of the servers, the only thing that's required is Python and the whatever necessary methods that you use to set up connectivity. What we're going to be doing SSH in this demonstration. So the first thing that we would have to do is get Ansible installed, and by default in my demo lab, Ansible is already defaultly installed, but as you can see here, Ansible is already at the newest version. This is in Debian, so the newest version it has is 2.2 in its repository, but Ansible's up to, I believe, 2.7. If I just take a quick look at my laptop, I'm running Mac OS, and I recently updated Ansible on that, and that is running 2.7. And so then we just got to make sure that our second um, server here, this is going to be kind of like a host server that we're going to interact with. We're just going to double check to make sure that Python is already installed on that server there. So in small implementations or non-production implementations, you can easily use root as the primary user account to connect from your Ansible server to the host servers. But uh, I'm going to show you how to actually use a user account to accomplish that task, because when you're looking to do more of a production ready production setup, you're not going to want to readily just use root. You want to try to use root as little as possible and make sure that you're using sudo and granting the necessary privileges accordingly. So in this demonstration, we're actually going to be using non-root. We're going to be creating a user account called Ansible on each of the servers. So that's going to be our first step here. And so I'm just going to give it a dummy password. And of course that's password. And then I'm going to do that on both servers here. And now that that is complete, so the next thing that we're going to do is on the Ansible server, we're going to become that Ansible user. And once we become that Ansible user, we are then going to generate the SSH key for that user. We're not going to set a passphrase because we don't want it to prompt us every time that we have to run an Ansible command to um, type in the passkey. There's a lot of problems that occur when you're trying to do it that way. There may be a way of using like SSH agent to add the key initially, but I haven't had much luck with that. It may be quick and easy, but typically in every setup that I've done and seen, the SSH keys do not have a passphrase on them. So now that we've generated the key, we're going to cat out the public key. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to take this key and we're going to um, add it to the authorized keys on the same server, so the Ansible server can manage itself. So I'm going to create this file, I'm going to add the key to it, and then write that out. And then once I do that, I am going to then change the permissions on that authorized keys so only the Ansible user or root can read it. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing on my client that Ansible will be communicating with. So I'm going to first become that Ansible user. Then I'm going to, because I'm not generating an SSH key on this server, I need to make the .ssh directory. And then I'm going to do the same thing as I did on this one. And I'm going to take that public key and I'm going to add that to the authorized keys on the other server. And then I'm going to update the permissions on both the directory and then the authorized keys. Otherwise, SSH will, if you don't have the proper permissions and other users can read your SSH key, typically SSH won't work. It'll just throw back an error about permissions and that it's not set up correctly. So definitely make sure that whenever you're working with your SSH keys that you're setting your permissions on those files accordingly. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is, because a lot of the things that Ansible, we may ask Ansible to potentially do are require elevated privileges, we're going to give the Ansible user permission. We're going to add it into the sudoers file to give it the ability to become an elevated user, such as root. And so I'm going to go back to the vagrant user, or you need to become root. Someone that you need to become a user account that has sudo privileges, because currently Ansible does not have that privilege. So I'm going to go back to the vagrant user and do a vi sudo, and then go into the sudoers file. And then at the end here, I'm just going to add in the permissions for Ansible. And then I'm going to write this file out. And so now I've completed that task. Now I need to do that on both servers. So I need to exit out of the Ansible user, and then I need to go into the sudoers file, so vi sudo, and then I'm going to add that permission to the sudoers file. Okay, so now that I've done that on both servers, I can actually test that by going back into the Ansible user and then running a sudo command like sudo ls root. And I don't get prompted for the password, and the command executes with no trouble. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add the servers into the known hosts file. And because the Ansible user is going to be SSHing to the remote servers in order to execute the different commands that it needs to run. So otherwise, when you're trying to run the Ansible commands, um, you don't want any of the communication to prompt you for any type of response. And when you do an initial SSH from one server to another, it prompts you for that host key. There are ways of, if you don't want to have to do this for every server and you got a larger environment, you can modify the Ansible config file and add SSH parameters to stop it from asking um, for the SSH key during the initial SSH connectivity. But for our example, we're just going to become the Ansible user, and then right now I'm on base 1, and I'm going to SSH over to base 2 as that Ansible user. And this is what I was talking about, where it's prompting you for the SSH key fingerprint. And like I said, whenever running Ansible commands, you don't want it prompting you. And so I'm just going to do this as a one-time to add it to the known hosts. So when I exit and I SSH again, there's no prompt. It just goes right on in. But it all and Ansible in order for it to run commands on itself, it actually SSHs to itself. And so we have to do this for both the remote host and itself. And so now I'm SSH'd from the host back directly to itself. So now I'm going to exit out of that and close that session. So now that the keys are created, the next step that we need to do is we need to tell Ansible about the servers that it's going to control. And what we're going to do here is go over to the Etsy directory, and we'll see the Ansible folder here, and we'll notice that it's owned by root. But because we're doing everything with the Ansible user, I'm actually going to chown and change the ownership of the Ansible directory and all its contents to the Ansible user. And so Ansible, and we're going to do a recursive changing of ownership on that. So now we'll see that it's owned by Ansible, and since I'm on the Ansible user, I can make modifications to these files. And so what I'm doing here is I'm modifying the Ansible host file, and I'm pretty much informing Ansible of the servers that it's going to control, that it's going to interact with. And so I'm going to, you can have ungroup hosts, you can group hosts into labels, you can have, if you have like a number of servers that have like incrementing IDs, you can include all of those servers with a single line by doing something like this here. Um, but we only have, so we could do this a couple of ways. By default in my blog post here, I have that I was just going to do this, but I could also do something like base 1, 2, and just have the single line here instead of 2 individual lines. And then I could also, so I could do it this way. So I could just do this, and it will include both of those. So it definitely allows for a great deal of flexibility and keeping the list clean. So if you have a lot of repeating servers, you can easily add those with one line. So it tries to make your life a lot easier. So I'm just going to do the base 1, base 2, and I'm going to write that out to the file. So that is the initial configuration for Ansible to get it ready for communication, to be able to allow it to SSH to itself as well as the remote host. We have the Ansible software installed. So now we can actually start running Ansible commands. I'm going to start off with just some standalone commands utilizing a couple of modules. So we're going to look at the ping module, and we're going to look at the shell module. And usually the ping module is used to test connectivity to your remote hosts. And so I'm going to run Ansible all -m ping. The all is a built-in keyword that you don't have to specify all in the host file. It just understands that when you say all, you mean everything that you have defined in your host file. And then -m is signifying that you're running a module, that you're defining a module, and the module that we're defining here is ping. And if I go ahead and run that, we have successfully connected to both itself as well as the other remote server, the remote host that we're working with here. Now, if we only wanted to run um, a module against a single host, we could, instead of specifying all, we could specify that individual host name, and it will only run that module against that host. And we also specified a group name, and so if we only wanted to run it against a particular group, we could do that as well. And so that allows for Ansible to be very flexible on which servers that you want to run the different modules against. Another module that we're going to look at is the shell module. And we're going to run this shell module. Let me just resize my screen here. I wanted to stop doing the full screen because I think it is easier to read and work with if it's not full screen. But okay, so back to it. So we're going to look at doing the shell module here. And what this is telling Ansible that we're going to run a shell command. And we're going to run this against the individual server base 2. And the -a is providing an attribute for the module. So you can't just run shell without telling it what command that you want to run. And so that's where the -a comes into play, is this is the attribute for the module. And so now it's going to utilize this input that I'm providing for that shell command. So I'm telling it that I want to touch or create a file called root in the root directory called test file. And by default, this would fail. But because by default, Ansible doesn't have access to the root directory. But I am specifying this -b, which is for become. And what that means is it's becoming the root user. And this, when we added the Ansible user into that sudoers file, that is what is allowing that Ansible user to become root. It's because if I in the -v, it's just for verbose logging to give us more input. So if I run this, you'll see here that it is running with this config file and that this failed. And the reason it's telling me this now and it didn't before is because I added the verbose logging. If I take out that verbose logging, it won't have the config file. And here, this is failing because of permission denied, because Ansible does not have access to that root directory, and the Ansible user doesn't. But that's where I can add the -b to tell it pretty much to use sudo to execute the command. So now if I run that, now it runs with a success. And if I come over to this other server and I go into the root directory, we'll now see that there is this test file that has been created by Ansible over here. And so that pretty much gives an idea of how the standalone Ansible commands are utilized just on the command line. The next thing we're going to go into are playbooks. Playbooks play a big part in Ansible in allowing you to define the host that you want to run the modules against. You can group multiple module changes together into one playbook. and then you can execute that playbook, and it will make all of those changes that you have specified. So it's like grouping all your different these standalone commands into one file, and then just telling it to run that file. Um, so I'm going to create a playbook here. So I'm just going to call it playbook. And playbooks are written in YAML, which is yet another markup language. And it has very specific formatting requirements. And oh, come on. It'd be nice if I learned how to copy and paste. Okay, so typically the hosts here I could change this to base 2 if I only wanted it to run against that other machine. I could change this to the demo servers to run against the group. I think that's the name of it. I think I named it demo servers. Yeah, demo servers. Um, so you could do that as well, but I'm going to tell it to run against all here. And then when you actually run the playbook on the command line, you could specify on the command line itself which servers or hosts to run the playbook against as well there. So you could leave host all here, and then on the command line specify a single host, and it will only run it against that one. Setting it on the command line takes precedence over what you specify in the file itself. And then here we are defining the tasks that we are going to execute. Here I'm just giving the task a name. This is not required. You could just provide the module and then the module's parameters. The name for me, makes it a lot easier to read the output of Ansible, so you understand what it's doing at each different task. So I typically always add a name to the different modules that I'm running. The first module here that I'm running is apt, and I'm using the parameter update cache to run what that's going to do is that's going to update the apt cache with all the latest packages, because what I'm doing on the next module is the package module, and this is what is telling the server what it needs to do. And for the package one, it's saying you need to install, you need to remove, you need to do whatever I'm telling you to do for package installations. And so the state here equals present is saying that I want these packages present on the server. And what this is demonstrating here is a loop. And so you're telling it name is equal to this variable. And this variable is item. And this item is populated with items here. So it's going to loop through each of these items and execute the package module. So it's going to install Apache 2, and then it will install PHP in that order. And so that's how it will utilize this module. Now, when I'm talking about modules, you're like, well, how do I know what modules I have available? On Ansible's website, there is a repository for, you can find it just by doing a Google search for Ansible modules. And first thing is the module index. And this provides you with all the different types of modules that Ansible has available for you to be able to use to specify whatever, pretty much anything that you want to do with your servers. And the way that Ansible uses playbooks and which roles, which we'll eventually get into, is it runs them as idempotent. or it tries to be indefinite. And what that means, I know people are going to tell me you're pronouncing that wrong, but that's how I learned how to say it. There's like two or three different ways of saying it, but I like to say indefinite. But what that means is Ansible is going to run that playbook, and it's going to check to see if the changes are needed. And if the changes aren't needed, it's not even going to attempt to perform the change. But if the change is needed, then it will perform the change. And so that way, it's designed that the playbooks and rules can be run over and over and over. And so that way, you could literally create a playbook to run against the server and set it up as a scheduled job to run every 5 minutes. And if somebody goes in there and makes a change to one of your settings or uninstalls one of your packages or something like that, Ansible will automatically fix it based upon that configuration that you're running against it. And it runs very quickly because if everything, if it's not making any changes, it just does a validation that your changes exist. And so that's very important to understand that this is the way that Ansible is designed to run, because when you're configuring Ansible, you want to try to use the different modules as much as possible, because the modules are designed to be indefinite. So they're designed to always validate your changes before trying to make them. If you bypass the modules and just run shell commands, that kind of defeats the purpose of being indefinite. And so, as an example, if I didn't use the package module to install the software and I just ran a shell command in Ansible to say, do an apt install -y, the package name, yes, it will install it the first time, but when you run it again, it will error out because the package already exists. And so, in order to program Ansible using shell commands, you would have to first run a check to check to see if it's there, and then based to register the results, check the result, and if the result shows that it's not there, then you would have to run another command to install it. So you would actually have to run three different modules or three different commands to properly set it up so that it checks to see if it's there, and if it's not there, then install it. Whereas if you just use the module, you have one module to run, and it will handle all of the validation for you. Granted, there are always scenarios where you have to run shell commands. And there are times where running shell commands are inherently indefinite. So if you're running a shell command to do a sed command where it just replaces a particular line if it finds it, that is by its own nature indefinite. So if you run that over and over and over, it won't break anything or won't throw back an error at you, where other commands will. Shell commands are typically used for if, like, you're collecting data and there's not a module to collect that data for you or to do what you're looking for. But try to avoid shell commands if you can, if there's a module to do the task that you're looking to do. So that's my little speech on that. And so definitely check out the module index that Ansible provides to go through there and see what different modules are available. Like for the app that I'm using here, there's an app manage app packages. If you're running like CentOS or Red Hat, there is one for Yum. If you're using, I think there's one for Zypper for SUSE Linux. So definitely pip. Pip has one here for Python installations. So there's Ruby Gems. There's a lot of packages out there. So definitely check that out and utilize that as much as possible when creating your playbooks and roles. So here we're going to save this playbook that we have here. And next we're going to run that playbook. And as we did with the individual command, Ansible command, for the playbook command, we're going to specify become. And because you need to be a privileged user in order to do the apt cache clear or update and to install packages. And so I'm going to go ahead and now by default, it will execute this against the hosts that are defined in the playbook. If I wanted to, I could run a limit and then base 2, and it would only run that playbook on the second server. And we'll take a look at that in a second here. But I'll run this playbook here on the 2 hosts. And here we could see where it says changed. So it actually performed this task. And when Ansible checked to see if it needed to perform that task, it found that it was necessary. And so it executed that change. And same thing here for the software. It does a check to make sure that they don't exist. And if they don't exist, it's going to install it. And so here, loop through those 2 different items and installed those using the package module. Now, and this is what I meant by idempotent, if I ran the same exact command again, you'll notice that it ran a lot faster. App cache is one of those ones that it will probably always show up as changed. You could probably look up the module and see if there's like parameters say, okay, only run the clear if it's so many days old or something like that. So it will only refresh it if it's past a certain time period. And so that way it will only come up green. It will only come up changed if that time frame is elapsed. Actually, let's take a quick look at that, and I'll give you an example of how to look up a module. So if I look at the package module, actually this was the app cache. So if I look at apt, and then there's a cache. See right here, cache valid time. 0 is the default, and so that way it's in seconds. And so when I run update cache, it's always going to run. So if I can actually take this cache valid, let's modify my playbook here, and I will cache valid time. Let's set it to 60 seconds. So it's going to only update it after the cache is elapsed a minute. So let's write that, and let's run it again. And then again. Okay, so that's not working the way I expected it to. So here and see if I can cache valid time. Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure exactly why that's not working. I would have thought that it would have determined that it was not past 60 seconds and would not have updated, but it did not. So we'll just skip on past that, but you get the idea here. These show up green now because the software is already installed. And so it's showing that it's okay and that it does not need to change it. So the last thing I'll talk about is roles. Roles are a combination of playbooks, template files that I'll do another posting on for roles and to get in details there. But it's a combination of multiple different parameters that you'll use within Ansible to build out servers. And what it allows you to do are create these roles based upon different parameters and then deploy them out according to how you see fit. So let's say you created a web server role and you said, okay, I need the web server software, I need to um, download the Git repository. I then need to install these 5 other pieces of software. I need to update these configuration files from the Git repository. Let's say there's a whole bunch of things that you need to modify to build a web server. So you create a role which has multiple playbooks, variables, template files, all those different things, and you can package those all up, and then within Ansible you can say this server or this server name is this role, and then it will automatically deploy all of that software, all those changes to any of the servers that fall within that naming scheme within your Ansible host file, and it will just deploy that out. So that's a really good way of starting to scale Ansible into larger deployments. One thing to definitely check out is Ansible Galaxy. Ansible Galaxy is a repository for Ansible roles. And so if you're doing anything that is pretty commonplace, there's probably most likely a role out there for it already. And so as an example, I'll find this PHP role here. Um, and it tells you, okay, here's, I can use the Ansible Galaxy command on the command line to install this role, and it will download it to your local machine. And then you can actually go into this particular role and look at all the details of how it's built out. Um, this one's designed to run on Debian, but there's all sorts of different roles that are out there. There's cloud-based roles for um, most likely there's like AWS, Google Cloud for deploying different things. So definitely check out Ansible Galaxy. I like to use it as kind of a learning resource as well, because if I take a look at some of the, I can look at the code within that role. And so there's tasks, there's templates. If I go into tasks, and so there's different playbooks within that tasks. There's the main one, and I could take a look in these, and I could see how he's using the different modules, such as he's using a stat module here, he's using get URL module, the command module, file module. So you could get a really good idea of how the different modules are used. Um, so if you're hitting like a roadblock on how do I use this module, the instructions are okay, but I'm missing something. So you can use those um, different repositories to really give you a good idea on how playbooks are built and how they can be used. So that concludes this introduction to Ansible, and I hope you were able to learn something and get something out of this video. I know it was a little long, but there's definitely a lot of information to cover. Um, Please come visit us at level7cloud.com. We have got a lot of different articles over there, and please subscribe. Thank you very much and have a great day.